Welcome to another Frontline recap. And now I've got a number of videos I want to point you at today, but the week has been dominated by the phone call between Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin. Let's see that.
Well, you have a situation where you have a lot of guns pointing at each other foolishly, because it would have never happened if I were president. That was not a war that was supposed to happen, and it did happen. So that's where we are. And right now, you have a lot of guns pointing at each other, and a ceasefire without going a little bit further would have been tough. Russia has the advantage, as you know. They have encircled about 2,500 soldiers. They are nicely encircled, and that's not good. We didn't talk about aid, actually. We didn't talk about aid at all. We talked about a lot of things, but aid was never discussed. We're going to be friendly with both. I think we're going to be friendly with both. China needs us in terms of trade very badly, but we have to straighten out the deficit. We have now more than $1 trillion deficit with China. It's not even believable. And we're going to be doing something about that. And with Russia, they would like to have some of our economic power. Well, I am a nationalist, but I'm a nationalist for the United States, not for anybody else. And it's interesting because there's nobody been tougher on Russia than me. I'm the one that pointed out Nord Stream 2, and I stopped it. Nord Stream is the biggest pipeline, I guess, in the world, taking care of all of Europe. And it was being built from before I got there. And somehow they were on the way. It was going to be, and I stopped it. It was just stone cold dead. I stopped it in its tracks.
So in that phone call, the detail is confusing because the readout that's come out from Donald Trump is different to the readout that's come from Vladimir Putin. And I think in good old Russian intelligence officer ways, Vladimir Putin, his readout, he's added stuff in that probably wasn't discussed. In particular, I think he's added in the fact that one of the conditions was that Ukraine would get no further support from any other country, whether that be military material or other military support in any other way, including intelligence support. I suspect that's not what was discussed and not what was agreed. But it's the sort of thing that Putin would throw into the conversation as a fait accompli, saying, we did talk about this, and put Trump on the spot to deny that that piece of the conversation ever happened. Things have moved on, and we then had a conversation between Trump and Zelensky, which didn't discuss the minerals deal. And Trump's team has said that the United States has moved on beyond the minerals deal, and that brought out even more discussions about potential American control of Ukrainian nuclear power plants and other critical infrastructure, and how that would provide security. The one positive we can get around all of the discussions, and the only thing that is consistent between all of them, is that there's going to be a sitting down of all sides in Saudi Arabia and starting to negotiate. That is a good thing, because war is diplomacy by other means. Diplomacy is about sitting down and being able to find common ground and talk through your issues. We're starting to get people together. So well done, President Trump, for getting that talking started. The rest of it around the outside, there's so much confusion. I actually think it's just noise in the background, because it seems to be changing every time we hear a different statement. Of course, we can't have Donald Trump without there being Putin making his public statement, and Putin's public statement is here.
Спасибо большое. Добрый день. Пожалуйста. Пожалуйста. Обращение с заявлениями и жалобами в органы прокуратуры выросло испытание.
You know, and we all know well, that our troops have recently conducted a number of swift, daring and effective operations. They are now completing the defeat of the enemy's troops in the Kursk region. I will repeat that according to our law, all the servicemen of the Ukrainian army, and especially foreign mercenaries who were on our territory and carried out a number of crimes against civilians, should now be qualified and are qualified by our law as terrorists. Their crimes should be revealed, recorded and thoroughly investigated.
Квалифицируются нашим законом как террористы. Совершенные ими злодеяния должны быть выявлены, зафиксированы, тщательно расследованы. Уважаемые коллеги, должна быть усилена ваша деятельность по всем направлениям, от которых прямо...
Now, in this Putin is talking about Kursk. That's clearly something that's been irritating him, and describing how the Russians have completely recaptured Kursk. Well, we've got no indications that they've done that yet at all. The Ukrainians have been withdrawing slowly. They've been under an awful lot of pressure. They have not been surrounded, as Donald Trump had said they had been, and as Vladimir Putin picked up on and then reinforced it. They are under a degree of pressure because the lines of communication that are supplying the troops into the Kursk region are under a level of air dominance, I'd call it, by Russian FPV drones. So it's very difficult for vehicles to get in and out without them being ambushed, but they're running the gauntlet. They're still getting in, they're still managing to do that. I think the Ukrainians have made a decision that maybe now is the time for them to cut their losses and withdraw from Kursk. They've achieved what they want to. Putin's emphasizing everything to do with it because he wants to have completely pushed Ukraine out of what he calls Russian territory, and it is Russian territory, even though a large proportion of the population are Ukrainian speaking. He wants to do that before they sit down around the table in Saudi Arabia. The Ukrainians, of course, are complying with Trump's lines. No, they're not. They have just attacked into the Belgorod region. Whether that attack is going to allow them to capture and hold any territory, or whether it's just forcing the Russians to reduce the pressure that's on the lines of communication into the Ukrainian troops that are still operating inside the Kursk region, it's too early to tell. So, two videos that I want to point you at today. The first one is from Lord Ricketts, who was a former government security advisor.
Well, Trump has made no secret of the fact he wants an early end to the fighting. And I've always felt that he wants to have a ceasefire that he can declare as a famous victory. He, I think, has never been too bothered about what the detail of it is, or whether it would be sustainable, how it would be observed, monitored, what the consequences would be if one side violated the ceasefire. These are actually all points that Putin had brought up in the hope of muddying the waters and delaying the whole thing, tying it up in a lot of complicated knots. But I don't think that figures in Trump's thinking at all. He's just thinking it will be a declaration of ceasefire, handshakes in the Oval Office, and then off he goes to get the Nobel Peace Prize for achieving this remarkable turnaround. But that kind of ceasefire would last days, I think, probably at most, and would very rapidly fall apart. So how long is he prepared to let this run? It's a very good question. He is so mercurial and unpredictable. He could suddenly take against Putin if he felt Putin was jerking him around and not taking him seriously. And we might find a bit as with Kim Jong-un, the North Korean leader. He went to Pyongyang, he hoped to land a big shiny deal, didn't quite work out, and then he immediately veered away from Kim Jong-un, who became public enemy after that. And of course, Putin's trying to avoid that. But I suspect Trump's impatience at some point or other will predominate, and he will say, I've done my very best on this. If they don't want my support, well, then they can just sort it out between themselves and step back from the whole thing. Potentially also step back from supporting Ukraine. That's the concern, because then after all this flurry of activity, Ukraine could be left weaker than it was, having to depend on European support at a time when the Europeans can't substitute for everything that the Americans are bringing to the table. So that's the worrying scenario, an impatient rejection of the whole thing, and America just pulling right back from the problem. That's not what any of us want to see. And I think that's why Keir Starmer is working so hard now to make sure that Trump knows that the Europeans are prepared to put serious resources, even including military, into this as part of trying to get a sustainable outcome.
And so that 100-day target that Trump laid out, should we be worried about that if we get to that 100-day target and Trump hasn't got a ceasefire?
I think the real target for Trump was probably the May the 8th commemoration of the 80th anniversary of the end of the war in Europe, which is clearly going to be a big commemoration, particularly in Moscow, where this is the crucial moment of their myth, really, or their the national story that it was really Russia that beat the Nazis. And I think he'd probably hoped that there might be some grand signing ceremony around May the 8th. If it drags out beyond there, then I think this factor of impatience and volatility in Trump could well push things the other way. I mean, I don't know, but I didn't. Having watched the first term, he quickly tires of something if he doesn't think there's anything directly in it for him in continuing to work on things, and that could well happen here as well. So there is a degree of urgency, and there is a degree of momentum that actually Trump has generated. I mean, to give him credit for that, and I think that's why European leaders are working so hard, weekend after weekend, to try and develop some momentum on their side as well, to show Trump that it's not just between him and the Russians and the Ukrainians, but the Europeans also have a major role to play here. And Keir Starmer, to my mind, deserves a lot of credit for that, working with Emmanuel Macron, with his Jonathan Powell, his excellent national security advisor. I think they really have put Britain at the front of European efforts in this crisis.
And I want to talk briefly now about the situation on the ground in Ukraine and its impact on the negotiating situation. Kursk and the salient the Ukrainians hold there is still crucial in this for all sides, it seems. Today, Zelensky has denied his forces there are defeated. But is it more conducive to ceasefire talks if Ukraine does withdraw from Russia? Or should Ukraine try now to bring whatever it can hold in Kursk to the negotiating table, if it can get there?
My own feeling is that Zelensky's motive in pushing his forces into Russia, invading that part of Russia, holding the territory, was to give themselves a card in the negotiations, a bargaining counter in the negotiations, that he could bargain a pullout from Kursk against something else that he needed from Putin. And it looks to me like Putin is determined to take that bargaining chip away from him by completing the operation to push out the Ukrainian forces to recover the Russian territory and therefore take that off the table. And I think that's part of why he is playing for time in this initial negotiation. He wants to get that military operation completed, hence his spectacle of arriving there in military uniform a couple of days ago. I think, therefore, that probably Zelensky's gamble in pushing that operation forward is failing. It did put the Russians under some pressure for a while, but Ukraine has not been able to hold the ground. And it looks to me like by the time any serious negotiation gets going, the incursion into the Kursk area will be over. So I don't think he will any longer hold that bargaining card.
And he's talking about Trump and the psychology and around everything that's been going on. And he opens up in talking about Trump's promise to sort the whole issue out in Ukraine within 24 hours of him taking office. But he says Trump and Trump's team now are saying, oh, that was just a sarcastic throwaway comment. And how many of Donald Trump's promises are sarcastic and throwaway comments? But we are in the 100-day line now, because not long after he got in, Trump's team changed the timeline, the goalposts to 100 days. And I think that's what Donald Trump is pushing forward to. But Lord Ricketts goes in and looks at Trump's psychology to this, and he says that Trump wants something out of it. He just wants to be able to hang his hat on and say, I've done something, I've achieved something, I've got a peace deal. He doesn't care about the detail of that deal. The sort of ceasefire that comes in, he wants there to be a ceasefire. It's a ceasefire that could only last days. Trump doesn't care. He just wants the tick box. I've got a ceasefire. And Lord Ricketts' reading of Trump, and he's had to deal with him in the past, I believe, is that Trump's impatience will dominate where this is going to go. And that impatience could turn around into him either turning on Putin, turning on Zelensky again. But I think President Zelensky is playing both sides very well. And the latest phone call with Donald Trump, the readout from both sides came very well. Or it could end up in Donald Trump getting bored with all of it and withdrawing completely, and withdrawing support for Ukraine, and withdrawing from negotiating with Vladimir Putin, and saying, Europe and the rest of the world, get on with it. In timelines, Lord Ricketts thought that the timelines would be focused on potentially the 8th of May. That is traditionally the May Day commemorations that Russia has for its victory in the Second World War, the part that it played there, the big parades in Moscow, and he thinks that Vladimir Putin will want to try and get some form of ability to say in his speech at that Russia has won, Russia has defeated NATO, Russia has got itself into a position where it can stop the conflict. Whether that's going to happen or not, we don't know. And that is why he thinks Putin is putting so much emphasis on continuing and trying to get as much as he possibly can in the east, but also in pushing the Ukrainians out of Kursk. A fantastic video. Can't recommend you watch it more highly. Our second video and our final video that I'm recommending this week is from a very old friend of the show, and that's Bill Browder. And what Bill doesn't know about the way Putin thinks and the geopolitics around it, I don't think is worth knowing elsewhere.
Vladimir Putin, in spite of all this craziness that we've seen, is very risk averse when it comes to his own personal interests. He's not risk averse when it comes to slaughtering Russian soldiers in battle. That doesn't even make his heart beat faster. But he's always been risk averse in terms of taking decisions that could affect his own personal interests. And this is a very scary situation for him, because on one hand, if he shows weakness, which a ceasefire would show, he puts himself at risk in Russia because he has to be a strong man. And if he's not a strong man, some other strong man may show up and say, I'm stronger than Vladimir Putin. Why do we allow this weak man to lead us? On the other side, if he were to reject this ceasefire proposal, then he enrages Donald Trump. And Donald Trump has a lot riding on this, solving this problem. And that could potentially be very problematic for Putin. It could, if in certain scenarios, it could lead for, if Donald Trump is genuinely enraged, it could lead to more weapons being provided to Ukraine. It could lead to more sanctions. It could lead to problems with oil exports and all sorts of other things that Putin cares about. And so Putin, who clearly doesn't want to look weak in front of his own people, can't really agree to some unconditional ceasefire. But he doesn't want to do anything that's going to make Trump look stupid. And so the best thing to do is to try to muddle it out, to try to not say yes, not say no, create some conditions. And in an ideal world, create conditions that make it so Ukraine has to say no. And I would imagine that that's what they're doing right now.
And on that point about Putin being worried about looking weak if he accepts a ceasefire, Mark Galeotti also made the point in the Sunday Times over the weekend that there are ultra-nationalists who in the long term may criticize any ceasefire deal as being somehow Vladimir Putin selling out Russian veterans who are returning from fighting in Ukraine. The ultra-nationalist criticism of Putin, so much as it exists publicly, how worried is Putin about that? How much does he worry about the ultra-nationalists within and around his regime?
I'm not sure if he's specifically worried about any different group, because Putin's got a pretty firm grasp on everything, and anyone who even puts their head above the parapet to say bad things about him ends up either dead, in jail, or in exile. But what I would say is that in order for him to continue to run Russia, to continue to be the dictator, he has to breathe the fear of God into everybody. He has to have everybody believe that they cannot utter a word about him without something terrible happening. And in order for them to feel that, they can't see him as doing anything that would suggest weakness, kindness, compromise, sacrifice. And whether it's ultra-nationalists or anybody else for that matter, he's got to be the strong man. That's how he's run Russia for 25 years. And I don't believe that he's ever going to change in that respect, because that's his only survival strategy. And so I've never seen in my whole life Putin ever making a compromise. It's never happened. He always escalates. And so it would be completely out of his nature and out of all history for him to somehow compromise today, right now, which is why I don't expect anything good to come from this telephone call.
What did you make of the symbolism of Vladimir Putin wearing military fatigues on his trip to Kursk recently?
Well, first of all, he looked really stupid wearing military fatigues. And I guess he thought, wow, Zelensky has gotten all this respect from his people wearing fatigues. He should do the same thing. But somehow it doesn't fit with Putin. You know, Zelensky looks like a warrior. Putin just looks like a stupid little man with his military fatigues.
Given what you said a moment ago, Bill, about Vladimir Putin never having really compromised on anything significant in his political career, why do you think the White House still appears to negotiate in good faith with him?
Well, we don't know whether they're negotiating in good faith. We don't even know what has happened in all these back rooms. We don't know what the plan B is. We don't know what the real agenda is. All we can do is watch this from afar and say what makes sense and what doesn't make sense. And there's a lot of stuff that doesn't make sense here. American people, the American population, the general public, doesn't like Vladimir Putin. Republican senators and Republican members of the House of Representatives don't like Vladimir Putin. And so it doesn't make sense that Trump would be acting against American interests in the interests of his own political party. But we don't have all the information. We don't know what else has been agreed. We don't know what else has been promised. All we can do is sit here and scratch our heads and say, this doesn't quite make sense, but we don't know why.
And this video was done before the Putin-Trump phone call. So he was anticipating what was going to be in it. But even though the phone calls happened and there's been so much confusion, I think what Bill is saying from a wider perspective is well worth you watching and listening to. And he goes into Putin from trying to understand the man. And he says, Putin is, when it comes to threats to him and his position inside Russia and anything that's there, he's risk averse. He's not risk averse when it comes to other people's lives. He's not risk averse when it comes to pushing his military into positions where they're using waves and waves of soldiers through a meat grinder. He doesn't care about other people, but he does care about himself. And therefore, Bill says his whole approach to dealing with Trump and dealing with everything else will be from a personal risk-averse perspective. And Putin, in his negotiations, will try very hard to set the conditions in Donald Trump's eyes for Ukraine to say no and Ukraine to be brought out as the bad guy in anything that's going on. And I think we're starting to see some of that happening in the moment. You have the readout from the phone call where Putin put into his readout that there should be no further support, military material or intelligence for Ukraine from anyone. But Bill also then came in and said, you need to recognize that Putin never compromises. And I think this is significant. He never compromises, he always escalates. And we have to bear that in the back of our mind whenever we see how he's dealing with Trump and where things are going to go. So no matter where Trump thinks he's going to get concessions, Putin will always be looking at this potential for escalation and never giving in. And as part of this, Putin's trying to change the way he looks and everything else. And this is clearly irking him. He sees Zelensky going around and being looked at from a hero's perspective by the Ukrainian people and by his military, by going around military fatigues all the time. He saw that being picked up in the infamous meeting in the Oval Office a couple of weeks ago, where Zelensky got ambushed and it started off over him not wearing a suit. But then we see Putin, for the first time ever, turning up supposedly in Kursk in military fatigues. And I think Bill reflected exactly what we all thought. Putin does not suit military fatigues. He does not look warlike or leader-like when he's wearing military fatigues. He should go back to his suit because he's not got the build for it, even though he is a black belt judo player and a former Russian intelligence officer. But again, the whole driver through the whole thing is going to be Putin's personality. And Putin plays the person. Putin will be playing Trump and trying to manipulate Trump from a personal perspective. Trump plays either the money or the assets. So he approaches things from a business perspective. Putin's got the upper hand here, and we need to watch that, especially when what Bill was saying, he's driven by a risk-averse approach, but also he won't compromise and he will always escalate. Thank you for listening to our recap this week. I strongly recommend you watch the videos. I'm Philip Ingram. Goodbye.